The elegant chandeliers of the crystal room cast a warm glow over the white tablecloths and sparkling silverware. Jasmine hurried between tables, balancing 3 plates on her left arm while tucking stray curls back into her neat bun. 6 hours into her double shift, her feet were killing her, but she kept a genuine smile on her face. "Here's your steak, medium rare," she said, placing the plate in front of an older gentleman. "And the salmon for you, ma'am. Can I get you anything else?" After making sure her customers were happy, Jasmine glanced at the clock. 3 more hours until she could rush across town to her night class at the music conservatory. She'd barely have time to change out of her uniform. "Hey, Jasmine," called Miguel, another server. "Table 7 needs more bread." "On it," she replied, heading to the kitchen. The head chef, Mr. Lai, was barking orders to his staff as Jasmine grabbed a fresh bread basket. "Late again for class tonight?" he asked, noticing her checking the time. "Professor Chen understands," Jasmine said. "He knows I'm working to pay off the bills." What she didn't say was how much those bills weighed on her. After her parents' accident 5 years ago, the medical expenses had piled up faster than the condolence cards. Her mom had hung on for months in the hospital while her dad was gone instantly. The insurance barely covered half. Between wiping tables and refilling water glasses, Jasmine sometimes closed her eyes for just a second, remembering how her dad's fingers used to dance across piano keys in smoky jazz clubs, or how her mom's voice could lift an entire church to its feet on Sunday mornings. Music wasn't just something they did, it was who they were. Before the accident, Jasmine had been on her way to becoming just like them. Her acceptance letter to the prestigious Eastman School of Music had arrived the same week as the phone call that changed everything. She'd framed the letter anyway, hanging it above the old upright piano squeezed into her tiny apartment, a reminder of the dream she wasn't giving up on, just postponing. The restaurant manager, Mrs. Patel, caught Jasmine's eye from across the room and pointed to the entrance. A group of well-dressed people were arriving, led by a man in an expensive suit who didn't wait to be seated before striding into the dining area. "That's Maxwell Richardson and his group," Mrs. Patel whispered when Jasmine approached. "The reservation was for 8, but it looks like he's brought 10. He owns half the buildings in this neighborhood, including this one." "Should I set up the extra places?" Jasmine asked. "Please." And Jasmine, Mrs. Patel hesitated. "Mr. Richardson can be demanding. Just do your best, okay?" Jasmine nodded, watching as the man gestured impatiently at one of the restaurant's nicest tables. He hadn't even glanced at the hostess who was trying to speak to him. Something about his dismissive wave made Jasmine's stomach tighten. After quickly helping rearrange the large corner table, Jasmine approached with menus and her warmest smile. "Good evening, welcome to the Crystal Room. My name is Jasmine, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Richardson barely looked up. "The lighting is too bright here. Fix it." "Of course, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady. As she turned to adjust the dimmer switch on the wall, she noticed the grand piano sitting in the corner of the restaurant. It was mostly for show these days, a beautiful antique that added to the upscale atmosphere. Her fingers itched to touch those keys just for a moment, but instead, she went to dim the lights for a man who hadn't even bothered to say please. Little did Jasmine know that in just a few hours, that piano would change everything. Maxwell Richardson's booming laugh cut through the restaurant's gentle murmur of conversation. He snapped his fingers twice for Jasmine's attention, even though she was already heading his way with a tray of drinks. "Your cocktails, everyone," Jasmine said as she carefully placed each glass in front of Richardson's guests. The ice clinked against crystal as she set down the last one, an expensive scotch for Richardson himself. "This isn't the brand I asked for," he said, not even bothering to taste it first. He pushed the glass toward her with one finger as if it were contaminated. "I specifically requested the 25-year, not this garbage." Jasmine checked the order slip in her apron pocket. "I apologize, sir. It looks like we wrote down the 18-year. I'll get that corrected right away." One of the women at the table, wearing a necklace worth more than Jasmine's yearly tuition, gave her a sympathetic glance when Richardson wasn't looking. The other guests seemed uncomfortable, but said nothing as Jasmine took the drink back to the bar. "He's in rare form tonight," the bartender, Gina, whispered as she poured the more expensive scotch. Last month he made a server cry over the wine temperature. Jasmine took a deep breath before returning to the table. Her mom used to tell her that dignity doesn't cost a thing, but sometimes it sure felt expensive to maintain. "Your 25-year scotch, sir," she said, placing the drink down gently. Richardson took a sip, swirled it around his mouth like he was auditioning for a whiskey commercial, and finally nodded. Jasmine felt her shoulders relax slightly. "Are you ready to order?" she asked, pulling out her notepad. The next 20 minutes were a blur of specific instructions. The steak had to be exactly medium rare, not medium, not rare. I'll send it back. The vegetables couldn't touch the sauce. The salad needed extra dressing on the side, not in a metal container. It affects the taste. By the time Jasmine delivered the main courses to the table, the kitchen staff had rolled their eyes so many times they risked permanent damage. Chef Lai had muttered something in Mandarin that Jasmine was pretty sure wasn't a compliment to Richardson's mother. "Is everything prepared to your liking?" Jasmine asked as the table began to eat. "The soup is cold," Richardson announced, though wisps of steam were still rising from the bowl. "I'm very sorry, sir. I'll have that heated right away." When she returned with a fresh, practically boiling bowl of soup, Richardson complained it was now too hot. Two of his guests exchanged glances. "I'm celebrating my newest acquisition tonight," Richardson announced to the table, gesturing toward the window where a sleek office building stood across the street. "Bought it for half what it's worth. The previous owner was too desperate to hold out for a better offer." He chuckled as if this was something to be proud of. Jasmine refilled water glasses, keeping her expression neutral even as Richardson bragged about how many people he had to lay off after acquiring the company. "Business is business," he said, cutting into his steak. "Sentimentality is for the weak." The dining room felt too bright to Jasmine now, despite the dimmed lights. The soft jazz playing through the speakers couldn't mask the harshness of Richardson's voice as he continued his stories about outmaneuvering competitors and putting people in their place. At the next table over, an elderly couple requested to be moved further away. Jasmine helped them relocate, apologizing without directly mentioning why they wanted to move. "Been married 52 years, the old man told her quietly as she helped his wife with her chair. "And I never spoke to her the way that fellow speaks to you. It's not right." "It's just part of the job," Jasmine replied with a small smile. But his kindness meant more than he knew. When she returned to Richardson's table, he was dissatisfied with the wine she'd brought, despite it being exactly what he'd ordered. As she apologized again, she caught a glimpse of the piano in the corner. For just a moment, she imagined herself sitting there instead of here, playing music that might even make a man like Richardson stop talking and listen. But daydreams didn't pay the bills, so Jasmine straightened her shoulders, fixed her professional smile back in place, and asked, would anyone care for dessert? Little did she know, the worst of Richardson's behavior was yet to come. The evening wore on as Richardson's party finished their main courses. Jasmine's feet ached, but her shift wasn't close to mending. As she cleared their plates, Richardson ordered another round of drinks for everyone at the table. His voice had grown louder with each glass of scotch, and heads turned from nearby tables whenever he burst into laughter. "Just water for me," said one of the women, covering her wine glass with her hand. "Nonsense, Diane," Richardson insisted. "We're celebrating. Everyone drinks." He looked at Jasmine. "Bring her champagne instead." Jasmine nodded politely, making a note. The woman named Diane gave her a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The restaurant had grown busier, and Jasmine moved quickly between her tables. She balanced the tray of fresh drinks carefully as she approached Richardson's table again. The floor was slightly uneven near that corner, something experienced servers knew to watch for. "Your drinks, everyone," Jasmine said, carefully distributing the glasses. She had just set down the champagne flute in front of Diane when Richardson pushed his chair back suddenly, bumping Jasmine's arm. The water pitcher she was holding tipped forward, splashing water onto the tablecloth and the edge of Richardson's expensive suit sleeve. The table fell silent. Jasmine's heart dropped. "I'm so very sorry, sir," she said immediately, pulling napkins from her apron to blot the spill. "Let me." "Get away," Richardson snapped, yanking his arm back. His face flushed red as he stood up. "Look what you've done to my suit. This is a $5,000 Armani." Jasmine stepped back, still clutching the napkins. "I apologize, sir. It was an accident. I can get some club soda for the stain." "An accident?" Richardson's voice carried across the restaurant. Other diners stopped mid-conversation to look. "That's the problem with you people. No coordination, no attention to detail." The air in the room seemed to thicken. A few gasps came from nearby tables. Jasmine felt heat rising to her face, but she kept her expression professional. "Sir, No, Richardson interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. His eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. "Tell me something. Where are you from anyway?" "Chicago, sir," Jasmine replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Chicago," he repeated as if he didn't believe her. "And they hired you here at the Crystal Room." He gestured around the elegant restaurant. "To serve people like me." Mrs. Patel, the manager, was moving toward them now, her face concerned. Richardson saw her coming and held up his hand to stop her. "I'm just having a conversation with your employee here," he called out. Then he turned back to Jasmine, who stood frozen in place. His gaze drifted to the grand piano in the corner, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "I've got a better idea," he said, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Since you're clearly not cut out for carrying water," he paused for laughter from his table that didn't come, "maybe you have other talents." He pointed dramatically to the piano. "That beautiful instrument has been sitting there all night. Instead of ruining more clothes, why don't you entertain us?" The silence in the restaurant was absolute now. Forks stopped mid-air. Conversations died. All eyes moved between Jasmine, Richardson, and the gleaming piano. "I'm a waitress, sir," Jasmine said quietly. "I'm here to serve your table." "And you're doing a terrible job of it," Richardson boomed. "I'm giving you a chance to redeem yourself. Play something. Anything." His smile widened. "Unless you can't, I'm curious to see what other skills you might not have." Someone at a nearby table whispered, "This is awful." Another person started to stand up, perhaps to intervene, but sat back down when Richardson glared in their direction. Mrs. Patel had reached them now. "Mr. Richardson," she began carefully, "perhaps I could offer your table complimentary desserts for the inconvenience." "I don't want dessert," Richardson interrupted. "I want our clumsy waitress to play the piano. That's my price for not complaining to the owner about the service here." He looked pointedly at Mrs. Patel. "And we both know how he feels about customer complaints, don't we?" Mrs. Patel's face fell slightly. She turned to Jasmine, apology written across her features. "Jasmine, you don't have to." "It's okay," Jasmine said quietly. Richardson probably thought he was putting her in an impossible situation, forcing her to embarrass herself. He had no idea what he was actually asking for. She untied her apron slowly and handed it to Miguel, who had appeared beside her, his face tight with anger on her behalf. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. Jasmine took a deep breath. "Actually, I think I do." She walked toward the piano, feeling every eye in the restaurant on her back. Richardson's laughter followed her, along with his voice saying, "This should be entertaining." If only he knew. The walk to the piano felt like the longest journey of Jasmine's life. Each step across the restaurant floor echoed in her ears. Her throat was dry. The hushed whispers around her seemed to grow louder with every movement. Behind her, Richardson chuckled to his friends. "This ought to be good," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. Jasmine reached the grand piano, a beautiful ebony Steinway that sat mostly for show in the corner near the front windows. She ran her fingertips lightly over the polished wood, remembering her father's hands doing the same on their old upright at home. In her mind, she could hear his voice. "Music speaks when words can't, baby girl." Mrs. Patel hurried over, her face etched with concern. "Jasmine, you don't have to do this," she whispered. "I can handle Mr. Richardson." Jasmine shook her head slightly. "It's okay," she said quietly. "Really?" She glanced back at Richardson's table. He was watching with an amused expression, swirling his scotch in one hand while his other arm was draped casually over the back of his chair. His guests looked uncomfortable, staring down at their drinks or checking their phones, anywhere but at Jasmine or their host. An older couple at a nearby table caught her eye. The woman gave her an encouraging nod, while her husband frowned disapprovingly in Richardson's direction. Jasmine pulled out the piano bench slowly. The leather creaked as she sat down. She adjusted her position, muscle memory from thousands of hours of practice taking over despite her nerves. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment as she closed her eyes. In that brief darkness, memories washed over her. Her mother singing while her father played. Her first recital at age 7. The scholarship letter from the conservatory. The phone call about the accident. The hospital bills piling up on the kitchen table. The pawn shop owner's face when she'd sold her mother's necklace to make rent. And then, her professor's voice from her night class just last week. Music isn't just something you do, Jasmine. It's something you are. She opened her eyes. Any day now, Richardson called out, his impatience cutting through her thoughts. A few nervous laughs rippled from his table. Jasmine positioned her fingers over the keys. She could play something simple. Chopsticks, or Heart and Soul. That's probably what Richardson expected. It would fulfill his demand without revealing too much of herself. But something inside her rebelled at the thought. For 5 years, she'd been holding back, keeping her head down, working double shifts, and putting her dreams on a shelf. For 5 years, she'd been Jasmine the waitress, not Jasmine the pianist. For 5 years, she'd smiled politely at people like Maxwell Richardson who looked through her rather than at her. Not tonight. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and let her fingers touch the keys. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled the restaurant. The piece began softly, almost tentatively, just like her courage in that moment. But within seconds, the complexity and power of the composition became apparent. Her fingers moved with precision and grace, building the narrative of the piece as Chopin had intended, starting with beauty, then introducing conflict, tension, and resolution. The music spoke of struggle and triumph, of pain and perseverance. Jasmine forgot about Richardson. She forgot about the restaurant. She forgot about her uniform and her aching feet. For the first time in years, she was just a musician again, speaking the only language that had ever fully expressed what was in her heart. The piece grew more challenging as it progressed, requiring technical skills that took years to master. Her hands flew across the keyboard, her body swaying slightly with the emotional waves of the music. The restaurant had gone completely silent except for the sound of the piano. Mrs. Patol stood frozen by the host stand, her hand covering her mouth. Miguel had stopped mid-step with a tray of drinks. The chef had emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, drawn by the music. And at his table, Maxwell Richardson sat perfectly still, the mocking smile gone from his face, replaced by an expression of complete disbelief. Jasmine played on, years of suppressed passion pouring through her fingers into Chopin's masterpiece. She was no longer performing for Richardson or even for the restaurant. She was playing for herself, for her parents, for the dreams she had put aside that never abandoned. And as the music soared toward its dramatic middle section, the entire restaurant held its breath, witnessing the transformation of a waitress into an artist before their very eyes. The Chopin Ballade grew more powerful as Jasmine's fingers danced across the keys. Her body swayed with the music, completely lost in the complex emotions of the piece. The middle section demanded everything she had: lightning-fast runs, delicate trills, and thundering chords that filled every corner of the crystal room. A young couple who had been celebrating their anniversary stopped mid-conversation, their dessert forgotten. The woman reached for her husband's hand, tears forming in her eyes. At the bar, Gina had stopped mixing drinks, standing motionless with a cocktail shaker still in her hand. Miguel, still holding Jasmine's apron, smiled with pride. He'd worked alongside her for almost 2 years, but had never known about this hidden talent. "That's our Jasmine," he whispered to another server who stood wide-eyed beside him. Mrs. Patol pulled out her phone and began recording discreetly. This was a moment that deserved to be remembered. An older gentleman dining alone near the window closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. His fingers tapped lightly on the tablecloth, following the rhythm. He hadn't heard Chopin played this beautifully since a concert in Vienna decades ago. In the kitchen, the loud clatter of pots and pans had stopped. Chef Lai and his team stood in the doorway, watching through the service window. Even the dishwashers had paused their work, drawn by the unexpected performance. And at his table, Maxwell Richardson sat completely still. The scotch in his hand was forgotten. The smug expression had vanished from his face, replaced by something between shock and awe. His guests exchanged glances, a few of them smiling slightly at his discomfort. Diane, who had tried to refuse the champagne earlier, caught the eye of the woman sitting next to her and whispered, "He had that coming." The music grew even more intense as Jasmine approached the piece's most demanding section. Her hands blurred over the keys, executing perfect octaves and complex chord progressions that usually took conservatory students years to master. Not a single note was out of place. Not a single emotion was left unexpressed. Halfway through the piece, she opened her eyes briefly and glanced up. The restaurant had transformed. People who had been enjoying quiet conversation over their meals now sat transfixed. Some had tears in their eyes. Others wore expressions of pure amazement. A few had their phones out, quietly recording the unexpected concert. Jasmine's gaze drifted to Richardson's table. The man who had been so arrogant, so dismissive just minutes before, now looked completely speechless. His face had paled slightly, and for once he seemed at a loss for words. She closed her eyes again and smiled softly, letting the music carry her forward. She played not just with technical perfection but with soul, something her father had always said couldn't be taught, only felt. The piece continued, building toward its dramatic conclusion. Her fingers moved with confidence born from thousands of hours of practice. Hours squeezed in between shifts, late at night when her neighbors were asleep, early in the morning before her classes. Hours stolen from sleep and rest, because music wasn't just something she did, it was something she was. A passing couple who had been walking by the restaurant stopped outside the window, drawn by the sound. They stood on the sidewalk, listening, more people joining them until a small crowd had formed outside. Inside, the restaurant staff had completely abandoned their duties. The hostess was supposed to be seating new arrivals, but stood frozen by her podium instead. The bartender had set down his shaker. The busboys had stopped clearing tables. Everyone was held captive by Jasmine's playing. As she approached the final thundering section of the piece, she poured everything into it. All the grief from losing her parents, all the frustration of putting her dreams on hold, all the dignity she maintained while serving difficult customers like Richardson. The music rose and fell, crashed and whispered, told her story in a language more powerful than words. And then, as the final notes approached, the restaurant collectively held its breath. Jasmine's hands delivered the final, resounding chords with such precision and emotion that the sound seemed to hang in the air, even after her fingers lifted from the keys. For a moment, complete silence filled the crystal room. Then, someone near the back began to applaud. Another person joined, then another, until the entire restaurant erupted in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, napkins still in laps, forks clattering to plates as they stood to give Jasmine a standing ovation. Everyone except Maxwell Richardson, who remained seated, his face a mixture of embarrassment and astonishment as he stared at the waitress he had tried to humiliate, the waitress who had just delivered one of the most magnificent piano performances he had ever witnessed. The applause seemed to last forever. People Jasmine had served countless meals to over the past years were now looking at her with new eyes. Some were wiping away tears. Others were still shaking their heads in disbelief. Jasmine sat at the piano bench, breathing deeply, her hands finally still after the intense performance. She felt lightheaded, almost as if she'd been in a trance while playing. It had been years since she'd performed for an audience larger than her night class professor. The feeling of connection, of being truly seen, washed over her like a warm wave. As the applause finally began to die down, Mrs. Patel stepped forward. Her eyes were glistening with tears as she gently touched Jasmine's shoulder. "I think our guests deserve to know a little more about our pianist," she said, her voice carrying across the now quiet restaurant. She turned to address the room. What you just heard was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, considered one of the most challenging pieces in classical piano literature. People murmured in appreciation. A few nodded knowingly, while others simply looked impressed without fully understanding the technical achievement they had just witnessed. Mrs. Patel continued, her voice full of emotion. Before Jasmine Taylor joined our team at the Crystal Room, she was on her way to becoming one of the most promising concert pianists of her generation. Jasmine looked down, feeling suddenly exposed. This part of her life wasn't something she shared with co-workers or customers. Jasmine was accepted to the Juilliard School of Music with a full scholarship when she was just 18, Mrs. Patel said. Her professors there called her a once-in-a-generation talent. The older gentleman who had been dining alone stood up. I thought I recognized the technique. It's the Horowitz approach to Chopin, isn't it? The emphasis on the melodic line while maintaining the complex undercurrent. Jasmine nodded, surprised. Yes, sir. My father studied under a student of Horowitz. He passed those techniques on to me. Mrs. Patel placed her hand on Jasmine's shoulder again. What most people don't know is that 5 years ago, Jasmine's parents were in a terrible car accident. Her father died at the scene, and her mother spent months in intensive care before passing away. A hush fell over the restaurant. Even the kitchen staff, still watching from the doorway, lowered their heads. The medical bills were enormous, Mrs. Patel continued. And with no family to help, Jasmine made the heartbreaking choice to put her education on hold. She's been working double shifts here while taking night classes at the local conservatory, trying to pay off those bills and keep her dream alive. Jasmine hadn't realized Mrs. Patel knew so much about her story. She felt vulnerable having her private struggles shared with a room full of strangers, but there was something liberating about it too, as if a weight she'd been carrying alone was now being held by many hands. She glanced toward Richardson's table. He was staring at his hands now, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. A few of his guests were looking at him with barely disguised disapproval. An older woman at a nearby table stood up slowly, leaning on her cane. "Young lady," she called out, her voice frail but clear, "my late husband was a patron of the arts. He always said that talent like yours belongs to the world, not just to the person who possesses it. You've given us a beautiful gift tonight." Others nodded in agreement. Miguel had moved closer to the piano, still holding Jasmine's apron. "I've worked with this woman for 2 years," he said loudly. "She's the first one to cover a shift when someone's sick. She remembers everyone's birthday. She helps the new servers when they're struggling. And not once, did she ever mention she could play like that." Chef Lai emerged fully from the kitchen now, still in his white coat. "She brings me tea when I have migraines," he added unexpectedly. "Always remembers. No sugar, extra ginger." Mrs. Patel smiled. Jasmine has been working here for almost 5 years, paying off her parents' medical debts little by little. She's never complained, never asked for special treatment. She just quietly works toward her dream of returning to school full-time. A man in a dark suit who had been dining alone in the corner stood up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice commanding immediate attention. "My name is Thomas Weber. I'm the associate conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Mrs. Patel's eyes widened. "I came here tonight for a quiet dinner before our performance tomorrow," he continued. "I certainly didn't expect to hear Chopin played with such mastery." He turned to Jasmine. "Young lady, talent like yours shouldn't be serving dinner. It should be serving music." Jasmine felt her heart begin to race. Weber was a legend in classical music circles. She had read about him in her music history classes. "I'd like to speak with you about our Young Artists program," he said, "and about scholarship opportunities. What I just heard deserves to be developed, not sidelined." Richardson finally found his voice. "I had no idea," he said weakly. "How was I supposed to know she could play like that?" Diane, the woman at his table, fixed him with a cold stare. "Maybe that's the point, Maxwell. Maybe we should know people before we judge them." As the implications of what was happening began to sink in, Jasmine looked around the restaurant, at the people still standing and applauding, at Mrs. Patel's proud smile, at Miguel giving her a thumbs up, at Chef Lai nodding with approval, and finally at Richardson's stunned face. 5 years of struggle, of grief, of putting one foot in front of the other each day while holding on to a dream that seemed to be slipping away. And everything had changed in a matter of minutes, all because a rude customer had tried to humiliate her. Sometimes, life had the strangest way of bringing things full circle. 1 year later, Jasmine stood backstage at Symphony Center, smoothing the fabric of her black concert dress. Through the curtain, she could hear the buzz of conversation as the audience settled into their seats. Tonight was her debut as a featured soloist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, a moment she had dreamed about since she was a little girl sitting on her father's lap at the piano. 5 minutes, Miss Taylor, the stage manager said with a smile. Jasmine nodded, taking a deep breath. She touched the small locket around her neck that contained tiny photos of her parents. "Wish you could see this," she whispered. The past year had been a whirlwind. The night of her impromptu performance at the Crystal Room had changed everything. Someone had uploaded a video of her playing to social media, and by morning, it had hundreds of thousands of views. Local news stations picked up the story. The waitress with extraordinary talent, forced by tragedy to put her dreams on hold, then rediscovered in the most unexpected way. Thomas Weber had been true to his word. Within a week, Jasmine had auditioned for the Young Artists program and received a full scholarship to complete her education. The program also provided a small living stipend, which meant she could cut back to part-time at the restaurant. But the biggest surprise had come about a month after that night. Mrs. Patel had called her into the office before her shift. "Someone has made an anonymous donation to cover the remainder of your parents' medical bills," she'd said, handing Jasmine an envelope. "They also established a music scholarship fund in your name at the conservatory." The amount was staggering, nearly $200,000, enough to clear all her debt and focus completely on her music. Jasmine had broken down crying right there in the tiny manager's office. They never confirmed who made the donation, but Jasmine had her suspicions. Maxwell Richardson had never returned to the Crystal Room after that night, but Diane, the woman from his table, had come back a few weeks later. "He's not as bad as he seemed that night," Diane had told Jasmine over coffee. "Entitled and oblivious, yes, but seeing you play, it shook something loose in him. Made him remember there's more to people than what's on the surface." She'd smiled mysteriously before leaving a generous tip. The memory faded as Jasmine heard the orchestra tuning up. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, soloist Jasmine Taylor." The applause was deafening as she walked onto the stage. The bright lights made it hard to see individual faces, but she knew her former co-workers were out there. Mrs. Patel had organized a group outing. Miguel, Chef Lai, Gina, and all the others who had supported her through those difficult years. They were sitting in the front rows, courtesy of complimentary tickets Jasmine had arranged. As she took her seat at the grand piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands in position, Jasmine allowed herself one brief moment to marvel at how life could change so dramatically. 1 year ago, she had been serving drinks and dodging the comments of people like Richardson. Tonight, 2,000 people had come to hear her play. The conductor raised his baton, and Jasmine began the opening chords of the Rachmaninoff Concerto. The piece spoke of struggle and triumph, of darkness giving way to light. A journey not unlike her own. Halfway through the first movement, as the full orchestra joined her in the main theme, Jasmine caught a glimpse of someone familiar in the third row. Maxwell Richardson sat there, watching intently, a completely different expression on his face than the arrogant sneer she remembered from that fateful night. Beside him was his wife, who gave a small, encouraging wave when she saw Jasmine notice them. Jasmine acknowledged them with the slightest nod before returning her focus to the music. She had no room for bitterness anymore. If anything, she owed Richardson a strange kind of gratitude. His attempt to humiliate her had instead set her free. As the concerto built toward its triumphant conclusion, Jasmine found herself playing not just for the audience, not just for her parents' memory, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated or overlooked. For every person with hidden talents and unrealized dreams. For every waitress, janitor, cashier, or driver who was so much more than their job title suggested. The final chords resonated through Symphony Center with power and conviction. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then came an explosion of applause as the audience rose to their feet. Thomas Weber, conducting tonight, turned to Jasmine with a proud smile. "Your parents would be so proud," he mouthed. As she stood to take her bow, flowers raining onto the stage, Jasmine couldn't help but think about the strange path that had led her here. How a moment of humiliation had become a doorway to opportunity. How music had always been waiting for her return. The journey wasn't over, it was really just beginning. Next month, she would record her first album. Next year, a European tour. and in between, she would be teaching piano to children from underprivileged backgrounds through a program she had helped create with her scholarship fund. Life had come full circle, and as Jasmine Taylor took her final bow, she silently thanked everyone who had been part of her journey, even the arrogant man who had mocked a waitress, forcing her to play piano only to find himself speechless. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places.